One of the really exciting things about YCS Atlanta is that so many different decks actually made top 32 at that event. And I know what you're going to think. You're going to think that, well, Doug, 20 of the top 32 decks were Pendulum Editions. And while that is technically true, in those 20 Pendulum Edition decks, you saw a ton of different variations of the strategy. People still have not come up with a standard build for Pendulum Editions, which really leaves this format completely wide open. And that's good and bad. I mentioned this in my YCS Atlanta deck discussion video last Friday, but basically what it means is that you can play pretty much any strategy and you'll have a chance of doing well, which then is bad because it means that the side deck room is really tight because you can't possibly fit in a side deck card for every single matchup you're going to face, which means that side deck cards that can hit a variety of matchups or the most important matchups really well are going to be very popular going forward. And in today's video, I want to talk about the top 5 cards that made a huge impact in side decks at YCS Atlanta so that you guys can put them in your decks for the rest of the month and for the foreseeable future, because we don't have a ton of huge releases on the horizon. We have some casual Blue Eyes cards and Thousand Eyes cards, but in terms of the competitive metagame, it's pretty much going to stay the same until we get the next main booster set or Forbidden and Limited list. So anyway, let's get started. At number 5, we have Chaos Hunter. Now, I sort of jokingly talked about this card a little while ago. No, this card does not stop evenly matched, but that's completely fine because it's more for Trickstars, ABCs, and Dinosaurs. If you are having trouble with any of those 3 matchups, this card is incredibly valuable. It is most valuable against Trickstars, though, because Trickstars are a deck that not only needs to repeatedly use Trickstar Reincarnation, both on the field and in the graveyard to gain advantage, they also need to beat over your monsters in ways that involve usually just normal summoning an 1800 attack monster. Trickstar Candina is basically the strongest Trickstar monster without activating Scapegoat to go into a Borreload Dragon, and in that regard, Chaos Hunter makes Trickstars in a really rough spot. It puts them in an area where they can't deal with the Chaos Hunter through their normal summon means, and they also can't deal with it through their best spot removal mean, which is Eater of Millions, because Chaos Hunter, it has kind of weird wording, but basically it's not that your opponent's cards can't be banished, it's that your opponent can't banish cards. And that distinction is really important because it means that your opponent can't use a card like Cosmic Cyclone even though it's banishing your cards. Your opponent can't use a card like Eater of Millions even though it's banishing your cards. However, it does mean that your opponent's cards can still be banished, which means you can use your own Eater of Millions and Cosmic Cyclone on them, or you can use Bottomless Trap Hole, all this sorts of stuff. So Chaos Hunter really only has upsides against Trickstars, and I know a lot of people are struggling against that deck. A lot of rogue decks especially struggle against Trickstars, so Chaos Hunter is definitely the go-to side deck choice for beating that strategy. And then it's also good against Dinosaurs and ABC, although not as good against those strategies because they tend to have more outs to it. Coming in at number 4 is a card I'm sure many of you are not surprised to hear about again, and that is Dimensional Barrier. This is one of the most effective one-card outs to an entire Pendulum turn. While it is true that they can still technically find ways to summon Heavy Metal Foes Electromite, it really won't gain them any value, and if you can activate D-Barrier against a Pendulum strategy on their first turn, you're essentially skipping their entire turn, which hopefully will allow you to OTK them on your next turn, or at the very least set up a ridiculous board to counter anything that they might have sitting around in their hand waiting for the Dimensional Barrier to wear off. Now, I will say that Dimensional Barrier is not very good when you draw multiples. However, you'd want to play multiples so you see it in your opening hand, but I probably wouldn't play Dimensional Barrier in super combo heavy decks that need all the cards in their hands to work and to make combos happen, because if you brick multiple Dimensional Barriers, it's okay in a deck that has like one card engines such as Invoked, which by the way, Dimensional Barrier also is very good against Invoked. You can activate it calling fusions when they choose to activate Invocation. It puts them in a really weird spot because then the Alistair doesn't get banished, so they can't recycle the innovation back to their deck, so that's, or invocation back to the deck, so that's very good as well. But in general, you're really just trying to use this in decks that have smaller engines so you can completely blank your opponent's turn and then hopefully get them on your next turn, capitalizing on them not playing any cards. At number 3, we have Anti-Spell Fragrance. Now, Anti-Spell Fragrance, of course, has pretty much always been a viable option against Pendulum strategies, but it's particularly good right now because so many Pendulum players are cutting cards like Twin Twisters and Cosmic Cycles from not only their main deck, but also their side deck. At most, they'll probably have just 3 Twin Twisters or 3 Cosmic Cyclones in their side deck, and they also have been cutting the time pendulum graph card from their main deck, which means that their best sort of main out to the card simply doesn't exist anymore. And that's really good for the player that's looking to completely lock a pendulum player out of the game, because it is really, really hard for them to play. Now, I will say that the most common out to this card that you will have to keep in mind if you're trying to play Anti-Spell Fragrance is going to be Purple Poison Magician, because then when that's destroyed, it can simply destroy the Anti-Spell Fragrance. So you'll really want either a form of effect negation, such as like Totally Awesome or Solemn Strike. You'll want something to deal with the Purple Poison Magician, otherwise your opponent will simply crash into one of your monsters and then destroy the Anti-Spell Fragrance. I will say, though, that outside of just opening the Purple Poison Magician, it's pretty tough for a Pendulum player to get to it if you flip the anti-spell before they activate any cards, because that completely shuts them off of most of their aggressive spell cards, such as Foolish Burial or Dragon Shrine, or any of those cards that get them to Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, which makes it pretty difficult to actually get to the Purple Poison Magician. So if you can activate Anti-Spell Fragrance early, it's pretty much always going to just win you the game immediately against Pendulums, but especially now that people are cutting out a lot of the counters to that card from their main and side decks. Coming in at number 2 is probably no surprise if you were at YCS Atlanta, but Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries was all over the place. Not only to hit Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, which is probably the most valuable use of it, but you can also hit things like ABC Buster Dragon or Invoked Mechaba, just a wide range of things that you want to hit with Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, and pretty much all the decks out there right now have something you want to hit. Now, I will say that's not so true for Trickstars, because Trickstars don't use the extra deck a lot, but even in that matchup you can hit Borreload Dragon, which really limits their ways to effectively deal with your monsters. I talked about that when relating to Chaos Hunter and how they have a difficult time getting over monsters with more than 1800 attack points outside of drawing Scapegoat and going into Borreload Dragon. So even in the worst case scenario, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries is at least semi-useful against a Trickstar deck. But really, you're doing this to hit Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite and ABC Buster Dragon. Those are really good hits, and even if you happen to draw a second or third copy of Ghost Reaper, there are plenty of cards that you can hit that'll actually still help you out. Decode Talker is a great hit against Pendulum Editions. Even some of their rank 4s like Tornado Dragon are really good hits in the mirror match, which makes Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries very valuable. Now, I will say that's not the most budget option if you're looking to play a rogue deck against like the Pendulum deck, because you can't afford the Pendulum deck. Then it might be kind of tricky, because you do have to buy at least one copy of Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, but that's kind of tricky, and it has sort of gone up in price since YCS Atlanta. But in general, it's still a pretty good pick against a wide variety of decks right now. Maybe when we shift into a less extra deck focus or a less linear extra deck focus metagame, this card might not be as valuable, but at this exact moment, it's quite good against most decks. Coming in at number 1 is a card that both of the people that I did deck profiles at YCS Atlanta for said was an incredible card in their side deck. They both played 3 copies. Both Kelvin Tahan and Alex played these cards in their side deck, and that is Artifact Lancia. So Artifact Lancia is really, really good, not only because it's a hand trap, but as Kelvin Tahan put it, as Kelvin Tahan put it, that Ryan Levine put it, hand traps that totally stop something for the entire turn are inherently more broken than hand traps that only stop one card effect. Yes, it's pretty annoying that Ash Blossom stops one search, but it's not like a Droll Lockbird that completely cuts your entire deck off from searching for the entire turn. And in that regard, Artifact Lancia does a lot of the things that Chaos Hunter does without the downside that if your opponent gets rid of it in battle, suddenly they can now banish cards. Artifact Lancia basically says, if you want to banish cards this turn, well, too bad, you have to wait an entire turn. It's essentially a dimensional barrier for the banishing mechanic, and that's really, really good. It also has the added benefit that your opponent doesn't need to special summon to activate it, because that's sort of the biggest downside of Chaos Hunter, is that your opponent actually does in fact need to special summon a monster for you to summon the Chaos Hunter in the first place. Artifact Lancia doesn't need that. Now, the matchup where I think this matters the most is not Trickstars, because Trickstars do almost always summon Lycoris before your turn starts, so they can get the most value out of Trickstar Reincarnation. But I think the place that this mostly values is in the invoked matchup, because a lot of the times when you're going against invoked, all they're doing is normal summoning Alistair and then activating invocation from their hand, and in that case Artifact Lancia is much better than Chaos Hunter, because Chaos Hunter pretty much will never trigger in a standard invoked matchup outside of them summoning the fusion monster, but a lot of times they're bringing out Mechaba anyway, which can then just crash into the Chaos Hunter, which is pretty tough. The only time that you'll really use Chaos Hunter against an actual invoked deck is if they're playing the Mech Knights or another engine like Wind Witches that can special summon monsters to trigger the Chaos Hunter in the first place, but outside of those cases, Artifact Lancia is almost always better. It also happens to once again be good against dinosaurs, not requiring your opponent to special summon something, which can be good against Miscellaneousaurus. If your opponent simply went Overraptor, send Miscellaneousaurus, activate Miscellaneousaurus, then Artifact Lancia would be a lot better in that situation. And it's also good, this might not matter too much, but it is very good against the Gem Knight FTK deck that did pop up at YCS Atlanta. It actually almost topped. Kelvin Tahan played it on the bubble, so it was very close to topping that event, and that deck completely loses to Artifact Lancia, which is worth noting. But anyway, that was my sort of top 5 side deck cards for this format. I think these cards are all very good and can be applied against a variety of strategies, which makes them very good, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you later. Bye.